When I was 10, I was in a bus crash. A group of us children were coming back from a ski trip in the mountains. I took a nap, I took my boots off, and I woke up to a leaning sensation. When I opened my eyes, I saw our chaperone holding on to the metal bus railings, screaming, "Hold on!" I grabbed the seat in front of me and looked down and saw sparks shooting up from where the bus was grinding against the pavement. I knocked my head against the seat after that and blacked out. I woke up underneath the bus and crawled out through the snow to stand with the rest of the children and watch the wreck. I was standing there for about 10 minutes before I realized my feet are cold. I have no shoes on. I went to a chaperone, and he was very kind, and he went back into the bus wreck, and he found me a pair of shoes, and he brought them out to me, and I put them on, and I felt very, very small in the world. My bubble of safety that I had operated in for my 10 years was suddenly shattered, and I was left with an inconsolable feeling that maybe this world that we live in has some artificial safety to it. So I grew up and I went on to do international development. And I worked primarily in infrastructure. And in that work, I ended up mounting responses to a fair number of disasters. I responded to earthquakes, I responded to landslides, I responded to floods. And in those times, I saw what it's like when the power does not come back on, when the water doesn't flow, when the banking system has no money, when the gas stations can't pump and the supermarkets have empty shelves. And in those times, I found myself thinking back to being that kid standing there in the snow with no shoes. I found myself thinking back to what it feels like when you're completely unprepared and your world has a sudden upheaval. Now, we live in miraculous times. I'm serious about that. If you took somebody from a few hundred years ago and brought them to today and showed them our electricity, our water, our food, our transportation that billions of people have access to, they would be astounded. Okay? I know it's not totally perfect for billions of other people in the world, and poverty is a problem, but for billions of people, those systems of energy, water, food, transportation largely work. And they are very fragile. And this is something we forget until we get into a disaster. So when you're in this situation where the world has turned upside down, and you're trying to figure out where you're going to get help, most people think that help is going to come in the form of the government or in the form of a non-governmental organization, an NGO. And while that's a good thought, because those institutions are there to help, largely the first help you are going to get doesn't come from the government, and it doesn't come from an NGO. It comes from people just like you who are trapped in the disaster zone, who happen to be in a position to respond a little bit better than you are, just like that chaperone was for me when I had no shoes. Okay, so what separates the people who are able to respond in the disaster from the people who need help in the disaster? That's what I'd like to focus on today. So, being an academic, I've broken this down into 5 areas that I think you can make preparations for a disaster, that I've given a little acronym to go with my story about the bus, and that acronym is SHOES. And those 5 elements are skills, health, orientation, equipment, and savings. If you can make preparations in these 5 areas, you will be in a position to help with community response versus needing help from community response. So let's go through them. Skills. So when is a good time to learn a skill for a disaster? Is it after the disaster or before the disaster? Anybody who has tried to download a YouTube video on how to make shelters from tarps in a disaster zone can attest to the fact that you should do this before the disaster, when the YouTube video is a click away and you can learn anything. And there are a number of skills that you can learn for disaster preparation. Okay, people assume that if you're not a medical professional, you have nothing to add. That's not true. People who have skills in DC power systems, low water consumption sanitation, cooking, carpentry, there are a range of areas that you can add value, but you need to get those skills before the disaster strikes. So, little homework. I want you guys all to think about a skill that you can learn, and tomorrow after this conference, go on YouTube and learn it. So next we have orientation. And orientation refers to your location in reference to the disaster zone and also in reference to your loved ones. So one of the major issues with disasters is a disruption of communications. It becomes very hard in a disaster zone to coordinate with people you know and meet up the way you might just call them right now or text them on WhatsApp. So it's important to coordinate with your family and set up meeting points and set up rally locations even outside of disaster zones. Make relationships with people who live in different regions, who you can rely on to go visit if a disaster strikes. So there's an argument about whether you should stay or whether you should go in a disaster, and I actually think it's a little bit of both. While you have the capability to help, you should stay and you should help. But people who leave disaster zones have much higher returns to normalcy rates than people who enter into IDP camps, internally displaced person camps, in disaster zones. Okay, so if you have a chance to get out, your opportunities to rebuild your life, to find housing, to find employment, to build social networks, increase significantly when you're not in a major disaster area. So now we have equipment. And equipment is what people mostly focus on in disaster prep. Okay, people think that they can buy some bag and they'll put it in a closet and then the disaster strikes and then they'll grab the bag and be okay. That's not actually the case. A lot of thought needs to go into what you want to have with you in case a disaster strikes. And I suggest that instead of buying a bag, you should build a bag. And you should build not just one kit, but multiple kits that cover different aspects of your life that are with you in different situations. So right now, I have a disaster kit on me, on stage, okay? I've got my cell phone, I've got a watch, I've got a wallet, I've got my keychain. That doesn't sound like a heck of a lot. But if you look at the capabilities that gives me, I can see in the dark. I can start a fire to keep warm. I've got a compass to navigate without GPS. I've got a watch to keep time and make meetings. I've got data that can prove who I am if I have to reestablish my identity. So making a small kit like this doesn't have to interfere with your life. This kit cost me under $5. This kit I can wear on a stage giving a TEDx talk. Okay, this is not gonna be a high risk to embark upon. It's a very low barrier to entry step. And it's a step I suggest everybody takes. Okay, and then you can start thinking about your bigger kits, the type of things that you might carry in your purse or your backpack. And in these areas, I think you should focus on two specific things to carry, and that is shelter and water. Okay, water is an extremely precious thing after a disaster. Carrying water with you and carrying water purification tablets is super easy, and it's something that can change your situation if a disaster strikes. People can die of dehydration in 3 days. So water is extremely important. And more important than water is shelter, because you can die of hypothermia in a few hours in a cool, rainy environment. Okay, I carry with me a shelter that fits in the palm of my hand. It's just a drop cloth and some mylar blankets and some string. And I can camp in the middle of winter in New England with that shelter. And this is not a joke. I was just out camping in that shelter with no tent, no sleeping bag, in temperatures that were 18 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe -6 or 7 Celsius. And with a small fire inside my shelter, it was 70 degrees Fahrenheit, or 21 degrees Celsius. So small kit fits in the palm of your hands, could save your life. Carry it with you. It doesn't cost anything. So once you've gotten into the habit of carrying these small kits, you can think about the bigger stuff. You can think about the food, the water, the 5-gallon jugs, the bleach for water treatment, the tents, the tarps, all the stuff that could help other people. And when you think about that stuff, you should think about helping other people. Having a 10-day supply of food for one person sounds really great until you're stuck in a disaster with 10 people, and then you realize you only have a day of food. So I highly recommend that people try to get those bits of equipment in place. So finally, we have savings. And savings gets to the fact that credit and debit cards are great, but they generally don't work in the disaster zones. So you should carry cash. I know this is very antiquated, but keep cash with you. Cash, it becomes very important. And keep documents that you can use to validate your identity. Now encrypt these documents, okay? Because you don't want your bank statement and your passport and your credit card statement sitting on a USB stick that anyone can pick up and do identity theft. But make sure you have backups of those documents with you so that if you need to reestablish identity after a disaster and you don't have your original documents, you actually have an opportunity. So those are my 5 areas. Those are the shoes that I think that everybody should have with them to be able to be better prepared for disaster. And if you can do that, you can start to think about how to mount responses within your communities. Because if you can take care of yourself, you can take care of others. And I'm going to end with just a quick story about community response from a disaster that took place up where I live. There was a flood in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1936 during the height of the Great Depression. And during that flood, there wasn't a lot of initial governmental response. There's a lot of people organizing, and they went out in rowboats and they evacuated thousands of people from flooded homes in rowboats. They didn't have helicopters, okay? And they were able to clear the streets of mud, and they were able to organize groups to go into people's houses and gut them before the mold set in. And they did this because they had a strong sense of community, and they had skills. And they didn't have a lot of resources, but what they had, they were able to share. Okay, so when the government finally did come in, the government did something that governments don't do anymore in disasters. They actually employed the people to build the things that they lost in the disaster. So they employed people as tailors and seamstresses to make clothing. They employed people to make furniture. And a strange thing happened in Worcester after this disaster. Within a few weeks, the main street opened up again because people had disposable income from these jobs. And within a year, they had an economic boom. So within a year, they had less unemployment than they had before the disaster struck. So this is my recommendation to you. Get prepared before a disaster happens. Get ready to be a good neighbor in a disaster and to be able to help your community. Thank you very much.